At 1 minute past midnight, a 50% tariff was supposed to hit Canadian dairy, alcohol, and furniture crossing into the United States. It didn't happen. Instead, hours before that deadline, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that he was pausing the entire thing, claiming that Canada and the United States, in his words, have a deal. No signed document, no press conference. Just a late-night post from the President of the United States and a very different, very careful response from the man across the border in Ottawa. That contrast is the whole story here. Because while Trump was declaring victory before anything was finalized, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney put out his own statement less than an hour later. And it said something noticeably different. Carney did not use the word deal. He talked about substantial progress, and then he added a phrase that a lot of trade watchers immediately zeroed in on. Important work still to be done. That single sentence tells you almost everything about where these negotiations actually stand right now. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back to where this fight started, because this isn't a new argument between Washington and Ottawa. It's the latest chapter in something that has been building for more than a year and a half. Back in February of 2025, in the earliest weeks of his second term, Trump signed an executive order slapping 25% tariffs on nearly all Canadian exports to the United States, with a slightly reduced 10% rate carved out for energy, critical minerals, and potash. That order reset the entire trading relationship between two countries that, for decades, had functioned as each other's largest and most integrated trading partners. Canada, under then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, responded the way most governments respond to tariffs. With tariffs of its own, hitting a long list of American products including oranges, alcohol, clothing, footwear, motorcycles, and cosmetics. Trudeau didn't stay in office long enough to see how that fight would evolve. Mark Carney, the former central banker who had run both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, took over as Prime Minister in the spring of 2025, inheriting a trade war that was already reshaping supply chains on both sides of the border. Within weeks of taking office, Carney was face-to-face with Trump at the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, in June of 2025. According to Canada's Prime Minister's office, the two leaders agreed there, on the sidelines of that summit, to a 30-day window to try to hammer out a broader trade agreement. Trump told reporters at the time he wanted to work something out with Canada. It was the first time either side had put an actual deadline on ending the trade war. That deadline came and went without a final deal, and what followed was a pattern that anyone watching this relationship over the last year will recognize immediately. Threat, brief negotiation, partial resolution, and then a new threat on a new front. By the end of July 2025, Trump set August 1st as a new hard deadline. This time threatening to raise tariffs on Canadian goods not covered by the existing North American trade agreement from 25% up to 35%. According to CBC News, that deadline passed without an extension, and the higher tariffs took effect on schedule on August 1st. Carney called the move disappointing. Canada, notably, did not immediately escalate in response. Then, just 3 weeks later, on August 22, 2025, Carney made a move that surprised a lot of people who had expected him to keep matching Trump tariff for tariff. According to the Associated Press, Carney announced that Canada would drop many of its own retaliatory tariffs, aligning them with the exemptions the United States already granted to Canadian goods that comply with the existing North American Trade Agreement, known as USMCA or CUSMA, depending on which side of the border you're standing on. Carney's reasoning, as he laid it out at a news conference in Ottawa, was that over 85% of Canada-US trade remained tariff-free under that pact, and that the average U.S. tariff rate on Canadian goods, at 5.6%, was still the lowest Washington applied to any major trading partner. It's worth remembering that steel and aluminum were a separate, and in some ways even sharper, front in this same fight. Trump had already pushed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum up to 50% months earlier, and at the time, Carney chose not to match that rate dollar for dollar, with Canadian steel producers reporting a steep drop in production tied directly to the dispute. Carney told reporters in mid-July of 2025 that he expected talks to intensify ahead of the August deadline, and he was blunt about the ceiling on what Canada could realistically expect. There's not a lot of evidence right now, he said, that the United States was willing to strike any trade deal with any country that didn't include tariffs of some kind. He pointed to the United Kingdom's own arrangement with Washington as proof. Even America's closest ally in Europe hadn't managed to negotiate a tariff-free deal. That comment set expectations early. Whatever Canada eventually landed on, It was never going to be a return to the tariff-free relationship that existed before February 2025. That set the stage for what was supposed to be a calmer period heading into 2026, with the broader USMCA agreement itself scheduled for a formal review sometime this year. But calm never really arrived. In January of 2026, Trump threw a new grenade into the relationship. After Canada and China quietly finalized a preliminary trade agreement, one that included Canada allowing 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into its market annually at a reduced tariff rate, Trump threatened a full 100% tariff on all Canadian exports to the United States if Ottawa went ahead with any formal deal with Beijing. This was a notable reversal because Trump had reportedly said days earlier that it was a good thing for Carney to pursue that arrangement. Carney's government responded by clarifying that Canada had no intention of pursuing a broader free trade agreement with China and would continue to respect its obligations under the North American Pact, which requires member countries to notify each other before striking major new trade deals with non-market economies. That January episode is a useful case study in how quickly this relationship can swing. Days before threatening the 100% tariff, Trump had reportedly told associates it would be a good thing for Carney to work out arrangements with Beijing, only to reverse course publicly once the preliminary Canada-China agreement was actually announced, which had already lowered tariffs on 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles entering the Canadian market each year at a reduced 6.1% rate, down from the 100% rate Canada had imposed back in October of 2024 in coordination with Washington. It was also, at the time, part of a broader pattern of Trump wielding tariff threats well beyond the Canadian relationship. He had separately floated tariffs tied to NATO members and secondary levies on any country trading with Iran, part of a wider pressure campaign that made trade policy one of the most unpredictable levers of his second term. Adding to that unpredictability, the U.S. Supreme Court has still not ruled, as of this reporting, on whether Trump even has the legal authority to impose many of these tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the law underpinning much of his trade agenda. A federal appeals court had already signaled a skepticism toward the administration's argument that global trade imbalances amounted to a national emergency, and that unresolved legal question hangs over every tariff discussed in this story, including the 50% levy that was just paused. That brings us into the spring and summer of 2026, when attention shifted to a different sticking point entirely: automobiles. According to Reuters, cited by Al Jazeera, negotiators from both countries spent months discussing a reduction in the U.S. Section 232 tariff on Canadian-made vehicles, potentially cutting it from 25% down to 15%, with the possibility of further reductions tied to how much it made content each vehicle contained, but the two sides couldn't agree on how to count that content. Washington wanted only parts actually produced in the United States to count toward the threshold. Canadian negotiators pushed back, arguing for a broader definition that would include North American content more generally. That single technical dispute, how you define what counts as American inside a car built partly in Ontario and partly in Michigan, became one of the central obstacles keeping a comprehensive deal out of reach for months. It's a dispute that matters more than it might sound like at first. The auto sector is one of the most deeply integrated industries between the two countries. Parts routinely cross the border multiple times during a single vehicle's assembly process, moving between plants in Ontario, Michigan, and Ohio before a finished car ever reaches a dealership. A strict U.S.-only content rule could force manufacturers to redesign entire supply chains built up over decades, while a looser North American standard would preserve much of the status quo. Neither government has been willing to fully concede the point, and it remained unresolved heading into August, even as attention shifted toward the more immediate crisis over the Section 338 consumer goods deadline. Which brings us to this past week, and the moment that gives this story its name. As August wore on, a new deadline emerged, this time under a different legal mechanism entirely: Section 338 of the old Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, a nearly century-old trade law that the Trump administration invoked to threaten 50% tariffs on a range of Canadian consumer goods, including dairy products, alcohol, and furniture. According to CNN, those particular goods represented roughly 5% of the total value of everything the United States imports from Canada in a given year. Not enormous in the context of the overall trading relationship, but heavily concentrated in industries that would feel it immediately. The new tariffs were scheduled to take effect at 1 minute past midnight on Wednesday, August 19th. According to CNBC, this Section 338 threat came on top of tariffs Trump had already imposed on specific Canadian export categories throughout the year, including metals, lumber, and auto parts, plus a separate round of tariffs tied to allegations about drug trafficking across the northern border. Tariffs that the U.S. Supreme Court actually struck down back in February. Trade analysts, quoted by CNBC, described the Section 338 measures as particularly damaging precisely because of who they hit: Not large multinational manufacturers with the resources to absorb a tariff shock, but small and mid-sized consumer goods businesses on both sides of the border, the kind with far thinner margins and far less room to adjust supply chains on short notice. One analyst called it deeply worrisome for a huge swath of Canadian businesses that had nothing to do with the broader disputes over autos or steel driving most of the negotiation. There's an important legal wrinkle buried in that Section 338 threat too, and it's one most casual coverage of this story skipped over. Section 338 of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act is not the same legal mechanism Trump has used for most of his other tariffs this year. Where the bulk of his trade agenda has leaned on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the authority currently tied up in that unresolved Supreme Court question, Section 338 is a much older, narrower provision that predates modern trade law by nearly a century and has rarely been invoked in the decades since the World Trade Organization system took shape. Legal experts who've commented on its use this year have noted that reaching for a nearly forgotten 1930s-era statute suggests the administration was looking for a tariff authority insulated from the same court challenges threatening its other trade measures, a detail that, if accurate, would mean these particular tariffs could prove harder to challenge legally, even if the broader IEEPA-based tariffs are eventually struck down. In the days leading up to that deadline, the pace of diplomacy noticeably picked up. According to CTV News and CP24, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer and Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc spent Monday and Tuesday of that week in meetings in Washington, D.C., trying to close the gap before the clock ran out. When reporters caught Greer leaving one of those sessions, he offered nothing but no comment. LeBlanc was only slightly more forthcoming, telling reporters, "We're going to continue working. Our job is not yet done." Meanwhile, Carney and Trump spoke by phone twice in the span of 2 days. Once on Monday, once again on Tuesday afternoon, with Carney describing the tone of those calls to reporters as very intense and delicate. According to the Globe and Mail, by Tuesday afternoon, Canadian negotiators believed they had landed on a proposal that could break the deadlock, but a source close to the talks cautioned that its fate rested entirely with Trump himself. Another source told the paper that officials on both sides had taken the technical negotiations about as far as they could go, and that the final call, deal or full-blown trade war, was now purely a decision for the two leaders to make personally. That same Globe and Mail reporting noted something worth sitting with for a moment. Canadian negotiators had explicitly warned their American counterparts that if the 50% tariffs went into effect, Ottawa would be forced to retaliate, something the Trump administration has repeatedly said it would not tolerate. That's the pressure both sides were operating under when Tuesday night arrived. Late Tuesday, Trump posted on Truth Social that he was pausing the 50% tariffs against Canada for a 3-day period, writing that the pause was based on the fact that Canada and the USA, subject to the finalization of documents, have a deal. In the same post, seemingly out of nowhere, he referenced the Keystone XL pipeline, the long-dead cross-border oil pipeline project that was canceled years ago, writing that it may be awoken from the grave, and posting an AI-generated image of himself pulling the pipeline out of a tombstone marked "Buried by Biden." No further explanation was given about what, if anything, that had to do with the tariff negotiation. Separately, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative put out its own statement describing the emerging deal as one that would include, quote, comprehensive market access for all American goods, economic security commitments, digital trade alignment, and many important provisions that will continue to protect our market and American workers, along with our Canadian partners. Substantial progress has been made, although there is important work still to be done. He confirmed that the postponement would run until the end of the day on Friday, August 21st, and that trade discussions would continue during that window. That gap, between Trump publicly declaring a deal and Carney carefully declining to use that word, is not a minor communications difference. It's a pattern that has repeated across this entire relationship for the better part of 2 years. Trump tends to announce outcomes before paperwork exists. Carney, the former central banker, tends to speak only to what has actually been confirmed on paper. Watching how that gap resolves over the next few days will tell you far more about the real state of Canada trade than either leader's public statement does on its own. And this is exactly the kind of moment where the full picture only comes together over the following days, not in a single news cycle, which is worth keeping in mind if you want to actually follow where this goes next, rather than just catching the headline version of it. So, what does the business community think is actually happening here? According to CP24, Candice Lang, President and Chief Executive of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, offered one of the more grounded reactions to the pause. Businesses may not be closing up shop with this news, she said, but an extension doesn't bring the certainty that a signed interim deal would. She added that companies on both sides of the border have been operating in what she called a limbo state for months now, and that time is of the essence for an actual resolution, not another rolling extension. That's a notably unenthusiastic response from an organization that represents the very businesses this deal is supposed to protect. And it underscores that the 3-day pause, whatever else it accomplishes, does not by itself end the uncertainty that's been hanging over cross-border trade all year. Think about what that uncertainty actually looks like on the ground for a moment, because it's easy to talk about tariff percentages in the abstract without picturing what they mean for an actual business. A furniture maker in Quebec or a dairy cooperative in Ontario doesn't get to wait until Friday to decide whether to ship a truckload of product south. Contracts get signed weeks in advance. Pricing gets locked in before a shipment ever leaves the warehouse. When a 50% tariff is scheduled to hit at midnight and then gets paused with 3 days' notice, businesses are left making real financial decisions: how much to produce, whether to hold inventory at the border, whether to eat a potential cost increase or pass it to customers, without knowing which set of rules will actually be in effect by the time their goods clear customs. That's precisely the kind of limbo state Lying was describing, and it's a condition that has now persisted in one form or another for the better part of 18 months across multiple industries. It's also worth being precise about what has and hasn't been verified here, because this is a story where the temptation to round up to deal reached is strong, and the actual reporting doesn't support that yet. Trump's own post used the word deal in capital letters, but immediately qualified it with the phrase subject to finalization of documents. Language that, in trade negotiations, typically means there's an agreement in principle on broad terms, not a signed binding text. The USTR statement described categories of what the deal would eventually cover: market access, economic security, digital trade, without specifying tariff rates, exemptions, or an implementation date. And Carney's own government, as of this reporting, has not confirmed what specific concessions, if any, Canada made to get here. A White House declaration cited by CBC News stated that the suspension was granted because Canadian negotiators had, quote, expressed a commitment to address the trade grievances the tariffs were originally meant to punish. But that phrase, expressed a commitment, is doing a lot of work without telling us what the commitment actually is. In other words, what's verified is that the 50% tariffs did not take effect on schedule, that both governments confirm negotiations are ongoing, and that a new deadline now sits at the end of day Friday. What remains unverified, or is being described only by one side without independent confirmation, is whether an actual binding agreement exists at all, what its specific terms are, whether it addresses the unresolved dispute over auto content rules that Reuters identified as a core sticking point, and what, if anything, the Keystone XL reference in Trump's post is actually connected to. There's a broader historical thread running underneath all of this too, one that's easy to lose in the day-to-day back and forth of deadlines and pauses. Canada and the United States have been trading disputes for decades. Softwood lumber has been a flashpoint on and off since the 1980s, and Canada's protected dairy market has irritated American negotiators for just as long. For most of that history, though, the two countries managed to keep those disputes contained, running alongside what was otherwise one of the most tightly integrated economic relationships on the planet. What's changed in Trump's second term is the scale and the frequency of the escalation. Tariffs used not as a narrow tool aimed at specific disputed sectors, but as a broad instrument applied and threatened again and again across the entire trading relationship. That's part of why this particular deadline, even though it technically didn't result in tariffs actually taking effect, still matters. It's not an isolated event. It's the latest data point in a much longer pattern that will likely keep repeating right up until, and possibly even after, a final agreement is signed. It's also worth noting just how unusual this level of sustained economic conflict is between these two particular countries. Canada and the United States share the longest international border in the world, a defense alliance dating back generations through NORAD, and a level of economic integration that, before 2025, meant a car could cross the Ontario-Michigan border 5 or 6 times during assembly without anyone thinking twice about it. Canada has consistently ranked among the top 2 or 3 trading partners the United States has anywhere in the world, alongside Mexico and China. Watching that relationship get renegotiated tariff deadline by tariff deadline, extension by extension, is a meaningfully different dynamic than watching Washington spar with a country it has always treated as more of a rival than a partner. That's part of why Canadian officials, including Carney himself, have repeatedly framed this less as a hostile trade war and more as a difficult but ultimately resolvable disagreement between allies, even while simultaneously preparing retaliatory measures in case that framing turns out to be wrong. If you've been trying to follow every twist in this negotiation, every deadline, every phone call between Ottawa and Washington, every partial statement from Carney or all-caps post from Trump, you already know how fast this story moves and how much nuance gets lost if you're only catching the headlines. That's really the only reason to stay subscribed to a channel like this one. Not for hype, but so the next update, whenever the real terms of this deal actually surface, reaches you with the full context already built in, rather than as another confusing headline stripped of everything that came before it. Let's talk about what happens next, because Friday's deadline is not some distant checkpoint. It's days away, and the range of outcomes is still genuinely wide open. One path leads to an actual signed interim agreement addressing at minimum the auto content dispute and some resolution on the Section 338 goods that were about to be hit. Another path leads to another extension, kicking the can a few more days down the road the way we've now watched happen repeatedly since June of last year. And a third path, the one Canadian negotiators explicitly warned Washington about, according to the Globe and Mail, leads to the 50% tariffs actually taking effect after all, followed by Canadian retaliation that the Trump administration has said it won't accept. Given that all three of those outcomes remain plausible based on what's been reported so far, treating Trump's Tuesday night post as the final word on this story would be premature. It's worth stress testing each of those three paths against what we actually know. The signed deal path would require resolving, in a matter of days, the exact auto content dispute that Reuters reported negotiators couldn't crack after months of talks. Possible, but nothing in the reporting so far suggests that specific gap is closed. The extension path is, frankly, the most consistent with the pattern this relationship has followed since June of 2025. Deadline approaches, tensions spike, some form of partial movement gets announced, and a new deadline gets set weeks or months down the line. And the tariffs actually take effect path is the one both governments have publicly acknowledged preparing for, even while trying to avoid it. Canadian negotiators' explicit warning about retaliation, reported by the Globe and Mail, only makes sense as a message if Ottawa genuinely believed there was a real chance the 50% tariffs could still land. None of that guarantees any particular outcome, but it does mean that anyone telling you with total confidence exactly how this resolves by Friday is guessing, not reporting. What makes Carney's approach throughout this entire saga distinct is worth pausing on one more time before we wrap up. Where Trump has consistently led with public declarations, announcing deals, announcing deadlines, announcing tariff hikes, often via social media posts that arrive before any formal government process has concluded, Carney has just as consistently declined to get ahead of the paperwork. He didn't call the June 2025 G7 commitment a deal. He called it a 30-day window. He didn't call the August 2025 tariff reduction a victory. He called it Canada matching existing exemptions. And now, facing a Truth Social post from the President of the United States declaring a deal in capital letters, Carney's own statement pointedly avoided that word entirely. Whether that caution reflects genuine uncertainty about what was actually agreed to behind closed doors, or simply a communication strategy built around never overpromising to Canadians who have watched this relationship deteriorate and partially recover more than once now, is something only the coming days will clarify. There's also a domestic political dimension to Carney's caution that's easy to overlook if you're only watching this as a story about two governments. Carney came into office as a technocrat, a former central banker, who built his early reputation on precision and credibility rather than political theater, first at the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis, then at the Bank of England through Brexit. Overpromising on a trade deal that later collapses, or that turns out to include concessions, Canadians weren't told about up front, would cut directly against the reputation he spent his career building. Every one of his public statements throughout this saga, the 30-day window in June 2025, the tariff matching announcement in August 2025, and now this latest pause, has been phrased with almost identical caution. Describe what has demonstrably happened. Avoid declaring victory. Leave room to adjust if Washington moves the goalposts again. Given how many times Washington has, in fact, moved the goalposts over the past year and a half, that pattern looks less like caution for its own sake and more like a lesson learned the hard way. To be transparent about where this account comes from, the reporting underlying this script draws on Fox Business, CNN, CBC News, CTV News, and CP24, NBC News, News Nation, The Globe and Mail, Al Jazeera citing Reuters, sourcing CNBC, and the Associated Press via Fortune and PBS NewsHour, along with direct statements from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and Prime Minister Carney's own office. Where those sources diverge, particularly on whether a finalized deal actually exists versus an agreement in principle, the divergence has been flagged rather than smoothed over. The specific contents of any eventual signed agreement, the exact concessions each side made to reach this pause, and the meaning behind the Keystone XL reference in Trump's post all remain unconfirmed as of this recording and should be treated as open questions rather than settled fact. There's one more layer of context worth adding here because it changes how you should read everything that's come before it. This is not the first time in this relationship that a Trump social media post has gotten ahead of the actual diplomatic process. Throughout 2025 and into 2026, several of the key turning points in this trade dispute were first announced publicly by Trump himself on his own platform before Ottawa had confirmed the details. the February tariff order, the August 2025 escalation to 35%, and now this pause. In nearly every one of those cases, the eventual on-the-record confirmation from the Canadian side came later, came with less certainty in the language, and in at least one instance, the August 2025 climb down ultimately looked meaningfully different from how it was first framed. That track record doesn't tell us what happens after Friday, but it's a reasonable basis for treating any single social media post from either side as the opening claim in a story rather than its conclusion, and for waiting on independent confirmation from named sources before accepting any version of the deal is done as fact. If you've made it this far into a story this detailed, there's a good chance you're the kind of viewer who'd rather understand a negotiation properly than just see the headline version of it, which is exactly the audience this channel is built for, and exactly why sticking around for the follow-up once Friday's deadline actually resolves will be worth it. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Trump says there's a deal. Carney says there's progress. Somewhere between those two statements is whatever actually got negotiated behind closed doors in Washington this week. And we won't know which version is closer to the truth until Friday, or possibly not even then. Do you think Carney's cautious, no victory lap approach is the smarter long-term strategy for Canada? Or do you think it risks looking weak against a negotiating partner who's willing to declare success before anything is signed? Put your take in the comments. Genuinely curious where people land on this one. It's a question that goes beyond just these two leaders, too. Every country currently negotiating with Washington under this administration's tariff. First approach is watching how Ottawa handles this moment, because the playbook Canada uses here, measured statements, quiet compliance where it serves them, retaliation held in reserve rather than deployed immediately, could easily become the template other trading partners lean on the next time they find themselves staring down a similar deadline. Whether that template actually works in the sense of producing a stable, lasting agreement rather than just another temporary pause is something we genuinely won't know until we see what, if anything, actually gets signed once this latest extension runs out. One last thing before we go. Negotiations like this rarely resolve cleanly on the first extended deadline, and this one has already been extended more than once. If you want the next development, and whenever Friday's deadline actually plays out, covered with the same level of detail rather than a rushed headline, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure that update actually reaches you. That's where things stand as of right now. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back with the next update as soon as there's something real to report.